Hello everyone and welcome to the Green Man channel. Hope you're doing good and well. So it's time for a Sunday premiere, and this time I'm talking about some of my favourite post-punk albums of all time. So that's right, this is just a selection. It's not necessarily a top 10 list or anything like that, like I sometimes do, nor is it exhaustive. There are many fantastic post-punk albums out there. So some of you might be wondering maybe what post-punk actually is. Maybe if you're new to this kind of music, or if you're very young and you're just discovering maybe some post-punk bands for the first time and you're wondering what that actually means. Well, I think Wikipedia, the way they describe it, I might just paraphrase a bit here. It's like a broad genre of music that came out of the 70s punk rock era, certainly in the late 1970s, and I think used more experimental avant-garde sort of elements from that era, really. That electronic, some of that synth sound as well, but you also had new wave in about that time as well. So I feel like it's also darker and more vulnerable than punk rock was. You know, punk rock's kind of quite in your face, but this is more, more on the vulnerable side of that spectrum, and perhaps that's another way of describing it, quite aside from being some of my favourite albums and bands are from this particular era as well. So actually also, many of you know me as a shoegaze fan and a dream pop fan. Well, for me, they're very much the children of post-punk. And I say that because shoegaze is very experimental, very arty, and so is a lot of those, or a lot of those post-punk bands from the late 70s and early 80s. So I kind of think shoegaze, could be maybe the son or daughter of some of these aforementioned, or some of these bands I'm about to mention actually in this list. So let's crack on with this list without any further chit chat. My first choice is actually an album I have only discovered recently. So most of the albums on this list I've loved for years and years. This is actually an album I only discovered earlier this year. Yeah, shame on me. This is The Chameleons and Script to the Bridge, which was released in August of 1983 via Static. And the reason that I discovered this album was through Lisa Frankenstein's soundtrack. One of the songs that played in that film was Up the Down Escalator. And I instantly fell in love with that song. I instantly loved it. From I only needed to hear about 10 seconds of it. I was like, yep, that's my kind of song. Go and check it out afterwards. And so I went on to discover this album. Now, I already knew of the Chameleons' name from somewhere, but I'd never quite appreciated, I think, how good this album is, the Script to the Bridge album. And I think Ned Raggett from AllMusic actually describes this as like the high watermark of the post-punk genre, with one amazing song after another. And I think I would completely agree with him that there is just one amazing song after another on this album. It's almost like, they are very, very post-punk. If anyone asked me to name a post-punk band that sounds very post-punk, I'd want to name this band. I just think they sound so much like bands of that era, but with absolutely fantastic songs to offer. And, I really enjoyed this The Chameleons album. I think it's really, really great. So that's my first choice on this list of 8. Now, my next choice is from a band called Modern English. And this is their third album called Ricochet Days, which came out on 4AD back in February of 1984. So if you want something, a bit on the happier side of the post-punk spectrum, I know most people probably think of post-punk bands as very depressing. Think of bands like Joy Division, The Cure, and some of their really dark and more depressive songs. But then, you have the other side of the post-punk spectrum for me, and you have bands like Modern English, who offered a more upbeat, more sort of, yes, somewhat bittersweet at times, but a more playful sound. And I think that's somewhat due to the delivery of Robbie Gray's vocals in this music as well. But they had a certain, slightly more up-tempo, I think, approach to their songs that were often themed on love and desire. And I think somebody else once, I can't remember who it was, but someone described Modern English to me once and said it's a bit like, their music, it's like the musical form of the warm glow you have after you've kissed someone. It's that warm, hazy glow, and I feel like Modern English offer that in musical form. And that's what Ricochets does whenever I listen to it. It's like really comforting, just gives you that hazy glow when you're listening to the songs, and whilst you're listening to them, not just after you've listened to them, but whilst you're listening to them. It's just very immediate. And obviously everyone knows I Melt With You. That's their most famous song. But this album has, I think, lots of really good songs on, and it's just one that I like to revisit to get that mood, to get that warm glow that I've been talking about. Now, my third choice is perhaps the most well-known choice from this list so far, really big album and a critic's favourite. That's the Smiths' The Queen Is Dead. And this album is fantastic. It's really fantastic. You know, I'm not the biggest fan of Morrissey, and I never really have been. But when someone talks to me about the Smiths, then I'm interested, because I love the Smiths' sounds. I like Morrissey's vocals in the context of the Smiths, and with Johnny Marr's guitar work in particular. I think Johnny Marr is just one of the greatest guitarists of all time. I think his guitar playing was so unique, and he brought that jangle pop sound, you know, really before anyone else, I think, did anything else quite like he did. I'm not sure I can describe it quite adequately, but I really love Johnny Marr's guitar playing, and I think on this album it's absolutely superb. I really love The Boy with a Thorn in His Side. I love Big Mouth Strikes Again. There Is a Light That Never Goes Out is on here. And I remember the time I first heard that song. That's one of those songs that I remember the first time I heard it, and I was totally blown away by it. Totally blown away. I thought that was amazing. What was that? You know, and it is a classic album. In 2013, NME named this as the greatest album of all time. Pitchfork give this album 10 out of 10. You know, you look at all the scores and the ratings for this album, it's 10s out of 10s everywhere, and you can see why when you listen to it. It is a fantastic album, lyrically and musically. It's very poetic, very moody, very somber, but fantastic at the same time. Now, my next choice is actually an album I named in my favourite albums of all time list last year. This is The Crossing by a band called Big Country. And they were a Scottish rock band, somewhat in the flavour of U2, but somewhat overshadowed by U2 in that era. And I think it's a shame, because this debut album from Big Country called The Crossing is absolutely brilliant. And it is, you know, certainly from that post-punk and new wave era of bands, they had a slightly just more straight up rock sound, but with this dual guitar sound that gave them almost like that Scottish Highlands feel. And I really love their stuff. In a Big Country was a hit, I think, in the US at the time that came out. And they just got a really, I think, an authentic sound. Stuart Adamson was a fantastic vocalist that we lost way too soon. I mean, he's not the only vocalist we've lost way too soon in these kind of bands, as we'll discover later in my list. But Big Country's The Crossing is a classic. I go back to it many, many times. It was high up in my all-time favourite albums list. I particularly love Chance. I love Close Action, Porriman. Oh, what a fantastic song Porriman is. You know, that melody, and oh, it's just amazing. Coming up next on my list is, you know, I mentioned them actually when I was talking about Big Country. This is U2. Now, U2 have just gotten too big for me. They just in the late 90s and 2000s in particular, I just found that everyone was talking about them. And when a band becomes so popular like that, you can be put off them. But I'm not talking about that era here of U2 actually. I'm talking about 1984's The Unforgettable Fire. Now, in this early era for me, U2 offered a lot of their best music. It was in that post-punk era. And this album was actually produced by Brian Eno and, I've got to remember his name, Daniel Lanois. I'm not quite sure about pronunciation, but the influence on this album can be heard, because obviously you think of Brian Eno and his ambient music, and this album kind of has an ambient feel. It sort of sounds really like magical and ethereal. And that, along with U2's sort of, I think they're really sort of immediate impact that a lot of their songs had in that era. You know, you had big pop songs as well, like Pride in the Name of Love on this album, but you also had those, like I say, those sort of new wave sounding songs on here as well, and those electronic ambient type tracks, which I thought just gave this album an atmosphere, but it had a very consistent atmosphere from song to song. I never thought it lost its flow or its consistency of quality, and it is possibly my favourite U2 album of all time. It always used to be Joshua Tree, but now I'm approaching 40, I think I much prefer Unforgettable Fire. As time has gone on, I prefer the Unforgettable Fire, I think, to the Joshua Tree. Now, my next choice, my number 6 choice in this list, is a post-punk revival band. Or they get called that anyway. They are not from that original era of bands. So maybe this will be controversial, don't know. But I think they're a great band that I think have the spirit of post-punk era bands. That's Sea Power, formerly known as British Sea Power. And I've chosen their third album because their second album I've talked about before on the channel a few times. So I thought let's talk about their third album this time, which is Do You Like Rock Music? But I actually thought to myself, well, this album I think captures that post-punk era sound even more than the previous album, Open Season. I think this really captures the essence of post-punk in this album. You know, songs like Waving Flags, for example, Lights Out for Darker Skies, Open the Door. They sound like they could have come out in the late 70s, early 80s, but with more of the modern production of the 2000s, a little bit more of that Editors type sound, if you like, and you know, just a great album. Sea Power, Do You Like Rock Music? Absolutely fantastic album. Now moving on to one of my last choices, and of course I haven't mentioned them yet, and yet I feel it hard to talk about this era of music without mentioning Joy Division, who of course went on to become New Order with the remaining band members after Ian Curtis tragically died. And you know, Joy Division and me, I go back a long way with them. I remember hearing obviously their very famous song Love Will Tear Us Apart, perhaps their most famous song actually. And I remember hearing that when I was a teenager, and it had a real impact on me. I really loved that song. I mean, it's played a lot, but it's a fantastic song that I don't get fed up with. It's one of those few songs that's been played too much, but I can still enjoy it. Even now, I can put it on. But anyway, I'm talking about the album Closer, their second and final album from 1980, which I think is considered very much a seminal release from the post-punk era. I think it's fantastic. I think it has that sort of experimental aspect to it. Really fantastic drum work on this album and bass work. You know, it's got a sort of, definitely has that unique flavour that was very distinctive from that era that not a lot of other bands were offering, I would say, at that specific time. And that's why Joy Division have been so massively influential. My favourite tracks on this album include Passover, Heart and Soul, and Decades as well. Now, that moves us on to our final choice, or my final choice here, which is Echo and the Bunnymen and Ocean Rain, which came out in 1984. This was their fourth studio album, which came out via Corova. And this, for me, is, you know, they went into a more melodic territory here, I think. They were really acoustic sort of based songs, a lot of these, but very, a bit more accessible than I think what they've done prior to this point. I really enjoy songs like The Killing Moon, Seven Seas and Ocean Rain. In fact, I think the second half of this Echo and the Bunnymen album is where it's at for me. That's the part of this album I really enjoy the most. But I do like going back to this one again. I think it does capture that era very, very well. And it's going to be an album you enjoy if you enjoy these sorts of bands and this sort of melodic kind of sound, and those sort of post-punk gothic styled bands of that era. Anyway, enough words from me. Hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to drop a like and a sub. Otherwise, from me, until the next time, I will say bye for now. But of course, I'm not oblivious to the fact I recently mentioned I'll be going on hiatus soon, and I will post a video specifically about that in the very near future, so look out for that. But otherwise, from me, until next time, it is bye for now.